me start off this conversation. Give a shout out to Matt Smith. He was the one that brought attention to your Substack page for me when he restacked one of your recent posts. So thank you, Matt, and Mike. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate this.
Yeah, you're welcome, Mike. I've listened to your show before. I actually listened to Matt Smith on your show, so it's kind of a nice virtuous cycle there that we all been introduced through one another. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation. I appreciate you with the invite.
What I find, I've written about this, posted about this on X, and I'm still kind of baffled that, to me, what the most important things are out there right now are just not getting any attention. And Matt Smith is talking about it. You're talking about it. And I'm blown away. I've sent Matt's Substack article, his recent one, about the Great Reset and where this is all going, to people in the media on the right. And I don't even get a response.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's hard for people to digest, Mike. That's one of the key problems that we've always had is literacy in things related to economics or finance. And there's a big gap as well in terms of monetary history. Nobody really teaches monetary history. I never learned anything at all in school, high school, university about monetary history. And yet I would say that's the real history of the world. If you really want to understand something, you need to understand the flows of capital and the flows of finance. And we get given a history, we get given like a mythos. Like you've got the American mythos, we've got the British mythos that tells us about how virtuous we were and all of the great things that we did and the people that we liberated. Although I would say today that's all under great threat because they're actually trying to demoralize us with our histories and kind of blame us for things as though I was there 300, 400 years ago enslaving people, which clearly is ridiculous. But it is being weaponized against us. But my point is, like, we get given this meme type history, and a lot of that is fabricated. There are truths within it. There's like kind of a mixture. I think it was Napoleon who said history is a lie agreed upon, which is kind of true. And you could also say that the victors of certain parts of history get to decide how that history looks. But one thing that I've found is when you study monetary history and you see where the financial flows were going, it helps you, so long as you're a critical thinker, to make sense of what was really potentially going on. It gives you a more honest take of it because you can chart the flows of capital and funds. And sometimes that leads to big contradictions in the official narratives. And then you can go deeper into personal histories and the lives of individuals. And you start to get a different view of the world. I call it fourth level thinking. It's kind of elevating yourself above the propaganda and the basic level of comprehension that we're given through our schooling. So all of that takes time, Mike, is my point. All of that takes time, and it requires you to want to get into the weeds of things. You've got to like reading, you've got to like studying, and you've got to be able to stand out from the crowd as well to make sense of these things, because there's always going to be propaganda on the left and the right. Everything that they tell you on the right goes through many filters to give you a certain outlook and to achieve certain outcomes. And it's the same on the left. And I think we've got a big problem breaking through that and piercing it. So yeah, for all of those reasons, I don't think many people will be discussing the kind of things that we're discussing now. Maybe they will in some kind of abstract way that's likely filled with propaganda and talking points that misdirect them. But that's what I try to do in my content, is to pierce through that. And I don't mind standing out, and I don't mind being an island in my opinions, because I enjoy it. I'm a natural contrarian, and I mean like a genuine contrarian, in that if you tell me something, I'll be very interested, but then I'll go away and want to really do my research on it to come up with my own opinion and conclusion. And sometimes that gets me the ire of people on both sides of the political spectrum. Sometimes I do feel like my opinions stand alone, but then there's a lot of people who enjoy that because it helps to get them to think outside the box too. So yeah, that's kind of a bit about me, Mike. And that's why I think we're going to be having an interesting conversation one way or another. I hope it helps listeners to think through some of the big changes that are happening in the world right now.
Well, and I think too, it's, people, they want, I get pushback, and I'm sure you get a lot more of it, where they're like, well, you're not providing solutions. It's like, well, the people that I bring on, like yourself, are providing solutions. They're just not what you want to hear. And I unfortunately, I'm sorry for that. Like, we're not going back to lattes and your yoga mats and the life you knew before COVID. And so I'm curious, like, when did you develop this idea for the fourth level thinking to get you to where you are today?
Well, it came out of necessity, I would say. I had an interesting childhood. My father was basically what you would call in the US mafia. So he was very high up in the British mafia. So I had a quite an interesting youth. I got to see power dynamics up close and personal. And, he ended up in prison for a long time. It was the largest ever smuggle of cannabis resin to the UK. So it's about $40 million worth in today's money was the value amount. So it was a big thing at the time. And after that, it left us, my family, in poverty. My mum and my mother and father divorced, and my family was in a really rough city. I mean, my dad was top of the kind of hierarchy in the entire region that we lived. But once he went to prison, I had a difficult childhood. It was rough, and you had to kind of fight for survival in that kind of city. But I did manage to come out of it, and it was a lot of work to do that. I had to pull myself together, get to school, go to college. I mean, I left school with no qualifications, so I had to go back a little bit later and redo everything, whilst also just dealing with the many. I mean, I left home really young too, so I was kind of floating around my friends' couches, educating myself. Ended up going to university, got my degree, went back and got a master's degree. And then I entered the career that I was in, which was social work and counseling. So I was working with other people who had been through, I would say, similar situations. And, despite doing what you would assume was the right thing, that's what I thought growing up, that if I do these things, if I go to university, if I get a master's degree, and then I get a career and I work really hard, that I'm going to have a good quality of life. And, I'll be able to afford a house and I won't have to be indebted. But it just wasn't the case. It just wasn't the case. And I never understood why that was. What I did know is that looking back at my parents when they was my age, and my grandparents to some degree too, they had a much better quality of life. And my grandmother never worked. She was a child, she was rearing the children. My mother, I mean, bearing in mind my dad had a bit of an interesting career, so maybe I'm not the best model on that one, but I could use my friends. Most of their mothers didn't have to work, or if they did, it was optional. And yet, in my generation, it was kind of impossible even with two people. So when I met my now wife, and she was very talented and high up in her career, and she was struggling. She was living in accommodation with like 6 other people and, just scrimping and scraping to get by. I was like, I need to figure this out. There's something not right about this system. There's something really corrupted that two people very advanced in their careers who have gone to university, got master's degrees, and all of our friends, Mike, were in the same situation. So it's not like we was just bad with money, although I certainly was. I was terrible with money. I'd had no financial education and maybe not the best role model in that as well. But yeah, I wanted to figure it out. And that was what led me to studying monetary history and finance, because I decided that I'm not going to follow this paradigm any longer. I'm not going to spend the next 30 years in debt trying to afford a mortgage or a house. I was like, no, if other people can figure this out, then so can I. And that's why I took that path. And then me and my wife moved aboard an 8-meter boat. So can you believe that? It was 8 meters long. And the goal was to just save every penny that we could whilst I lent finance. And yeah, I made some promises to her that I'd buy her a house one day, I'd buy her a farm, and that she could quit a job and we could live the way we wanted to. And that was really my motivator, was to provide a life for my family. So that's what I did. And yeah, that's I don't know if that answers the question, Mike, but that's kind of the backstory as to how I started learning about these things.
And then you realized at that point, through all your research, that the system was just one big fugazi, and everything you were taught when you were a young child, I'm kind of echoing myself here, but you were taught when you were a young person, it was a complete lie.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when you learn it, and like I said, my dad was a criminal, but and once I learned how the system works, I thought, well, what he did was nothing compared to these criminals who actually run this system, because it is a criminal system, and it destroys the hardest working, I would say, Mike, because in a real economy, you've got people who go out every day and they put their time and their labor into nature's economy. So, you've got farmers out there that are tilling the land and producing the stuff that we need to survive. You've got people out there working in mines, pulling out the commodities that we need to have all of this stuff around us that makes our life easy. And then on the flip side, you've got people who don't do any of that. They don't provide any actual natural materials to the real economy. They don't work in the real economy. They go out and sit at a computer all day and tap some screens, or they make Hollywood movies. And we've got all kinds of crazy positions that people have. And they are rewarded so much more. Their compensation is so much higher. And I just think that's wrong. It's backwards. We should value people who actually work in the real economy, because everything else rests upon that. If you don't have a strong real economy and people working in nature's economy and actually being compensated properly for that, it leads to a corrupt society, because people then don't want to actually have one of these normal jobs. It cheapens you and it demoralizes you as a human being. It actually takes away your dignity. And then you have a society where people are just on this treadmill trying to chase the dollar and to have an outsized life, more cars, 2 cars, 3 cars. And that's kind of been necessary in America to create this consumption culture to allow this expansion of the debt. And I think that's why we've got a really corrupted society. And I would say we've got lots of people today who, when it comes to morality and ethics, it's really low. And it all comes from that original sin, I would say, which is cheapening labor and the real economy and creating a financialized system, a system where people who work in the financial sector, or we are speculating on financialized assets, that's allowed to balloon so much higher than this bottom part of the pyramid that could sustain that, which is the people who produce food and real goods. So yeah, that's always just been, to me, an aberration. And the problem is we've got to the point now where that bottom part of that pyramid that's meant to sustain this huge system is crumbling. That's what we're seeing in America. We don't have any manufacturing in America. The farmers can no longer afford to farm. The land's being taken away from them. And it creates a mass vulnerability in society. Because one thing that I do know, Mike, is if the farmers ain't farming and they ain't producing the food that we need to eat, the people in the financial sector ain't going to do it for us. They're not going to buy it in from another country. So we're going to be screwed as nations. And I think that's the problem, is where we are right now. We're at that real turn point where if something drastic isn't done, we're in big trouble. We're in big trouble because most of our nations are not self-sufficient, and they're not going to be able to handle a major downturn. And because of the financial system being so ballooned, we're heading towards that financial crisis moment. And if you go back to the 1930s, the Great Depression, 1 in 3 people lived on a farm back then, Mike. So that means that when the crisis hit, people just planted extra fields of potatoes, and everyone knew somebody who had a farm. If you didn't have a farm, your sister had a farm or your brother had a farm. Today, it's 1 in 70 Americans. And those farms are not the same farms that we had in the 1930s, where it was these self-sufficient units, where people had wells, they had a nice mixture of crops, they had animals, they had a cow. So each farm was a self-sufficient unit that could provide enough for oneself, one's family, and then also a few neighbors too. You could sell some goods. Now it's this big, massive monoculture production. So that's not going to work in a crisis either. So these are the things that percolate my brain, Mike. These are the things I worry about when I think about a potential major downturn in the global economy, which it looks like we're on the precipice of.
Well, and I think when you look back at that time period as well, being born in the Great Depression, my grandparents were part of that. My grandmother was born in 1917 and my grandfather was 1911, and life was hard, right? Like, you were born into a difficult, it was, you in the Great Depression, nobody cared about money. Nobody had any money. But also we had manufacturing here in America. So there was hope, and there was a mental toughness that I don't see today. The fragility here in the States, and COVID showed this, and touching on what you said earlier about how divided we are, another kind of shock to the system. And I think people will crumble, and I think they'll comply too. This episode is brought to you by McElvaney Financial Group. Their advisors bring a depth of knowledge and experience that allow them to serve their clientele with care, ensuring their financial needs are met now and in the future. Personally, I'm not saying cash is worthless, but you can see what's happening. It's worth less every year. Gold is the opposite. Click on the promo link in the show notes or go to www.mcelvaney.com/coffeeandamike.
Yeah, I think that's what we're going to see. I think we've got a lot of very weak people, lots of desperate people, angry people, and the problem is the system that they've created, it is fueled on antagonism between different groups in society, and that's not going to change. I think that's where America had to go to continue the system. To continue pushing forward these different agendas, it had to antagonize society through propaganda. And it's not just America, it's most Western nations. One way or another, we have been divided to such a degree that when that crisis comes, I don't think it's going to be people pulling together as communities. I think a lot of these places are going to be really difficult. America has more medicated people on planet Earth with psychotropic drugs. It's got more guns on planet Earth than any other nation by a long way. So you have to think that times are going to get tougher, and it's never been more important to just think about where you're located and what you have access to. When I spoke earlier about that bottom layer of the system, which is the stuff you need to survive, it's your food, your water, your energy, those things, those assumptions are no longer there. You need to remove those assumptions that it's going to be freely available and that you're going to have access to it, because we're starting to see now, particularly with the destruction of supply chains and blackouts, cyber attacks, infrastructure attacks, all of those things are now happening. We're really living through a global hybrid war. That's the fundamental truth of it all, is it's a global hybrid war, and it's not a kinetic war like in World War II, but it's very much the same in that the old world order has collapsed. It's already gone. I mean, the three pillars of the old world order were US treasuries as the world's trusted reserve asset, the US as the global protectorate of the allied nations, so it allowed these nations to use the waterways and to trade freely, and globalized world trade. That was the three pillars of the old system, and every one of them is now crumbling. I mean, US treasuries as the global reserve asset, de-dollarization has been happening for some time, but it's sped up greatly since Donald Trump's second presidency began, because I mean, just think about it, Mike. They've literally said we're going to devalue the dollar, and the dollar itself is just debt. So those treasuries that people have, they own those treasuries. Suppose they believe it's a safe haven asset, but the interest on those treasuries and the capital has to be paid with more debt. So the debt that you owe, the debt that you owned, more debt has to be created to pay off that debt, and that debt that's created has more debt on top of it. Yeah, it's a huge, massive Ponzi scheme. And it only works through trust. So once trust is lost in the dollar, you're going to see this huge rush out of it, and people are going to scramble for safety. And that's what we're seeing take place right now. That's why, gold was going up $60, $100 a day. And that's going to continue as people figure it out. We might have figured it out a long time ago, Mike, but a lot of people didn't. They were brought up in this era where the dollar was king, and, you could trust the US to not debase its currency too fast. We had a strong dollar. All of that's now disintegrating. So that's the first pillar gone. And then I'd say the second pillar, the US is the global protectorate of allied nations. Well, I think when Nord Stream got blown up, that was the Rubicon crossed. And it's escalated quickly. Now we've got nations like Greenland and Canada being told, well, yeah, your land's up for grabs. So America, as it fails, it's kind of like a drowning man. And, I love America, so I don't want people to think I'm anti-American. I love everything that America stood for. So when I talk about America, I'm not talking about the America that you and I love. I'm talking about this corporate America, the one that's this America, the corporation is how I'd call it. It's kind of like a corporation that serves other corporations, which would be, the military industrial complex and big pharma. Those are the guys who have got you so indebted. It's not you guys, it's those people that used America for private profit. And, look at 2008 with the GFC. You had private profits and socialized losses when the banks were making all these huge bets, and those banks should have been allowed to fail. It was the taxpayers who had to bail them out. That's where the national debt came from. It's the same with the wars. All the wars that America has been involved in, and young Americans went and sacrificed their lives for some narrative that was given to them, that expanded your national debt massively, and it paid off the military-industrial complex. But for what, Mike? What did you achieve in those wars? What were they really about? It wasn't about what we were told. So, the US is very indebted, and yeah, that second pillar, the US is the global protectorate of the trade routes. Well, I don't think other nations feel so safe in the US anymore, because it looks to me like as the US starts to go into this collapse moment, as the oil system comes down, the US is going to try and ensure it's on top of whatever collapse happens. And I think that's the narrative we're seeing play out in the real world right now, is this period of great conflict as the US tries desperately to ensure that it doesn't lose its hegemony, even if it means taking down everyone and anyone, even their allies or supposed allies. So that's pillar number two. That's gone. And the third one is globalized trade. And we're seeing, I don't have to say what's happening to global trade. It is like the 1930s when the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Acts came in. We saw world trade collapse, and I think trade to America fell by 60%. Well, if you look at what's happening at the ports right now, and I know you had a specialist on just recently talking about that, we are seeing that those kind of levels look at potential, that we could see trade to the imports to the US fall by 40, 50%. So once all those three pillars have gone, Mike, of the post-World War II system, that means the system's gone. And when you realize that, you say, wow, I better take this seriously, because that means all of the assumptions that I had need to be reassessed, because I don't know what we're going into. But I know historically speaking, these periods of history, when one system falls apart and there's a big power vacuum, as people say, well, who's going to lead the new system? Which currency is going to be on top? Who's going to have the most say in this? That's when you have huge global conflict. It's called the Thucydides trap moment, which is when you've got the rising superpower, or you go towards a multipolarity, and then you've got the existing hegemon that doesn't want to allow that or step aside. And the US is doing just like Great Britain did during this period of history, going into the 1900s, when you had the rising industrial powers of Germany, of Russia, and the US, and you had to decide who's going to lead this next one, and that led to two world wars, and many other issues happened throughout that period. So I think we're in a similar period, but like I said, this one's more of a hybrid war, because I don't think they want to total the infrastructure as such. It doesn't mean there isn't going to be kinetic warfare elements, but I think it's going to play out through things like biological warfare, economic warfare. Nord Stream was a great example of that. Cyber warfare, blackouts, energy infrastructure being blown up. And so that's the period we're living through. And that's my take on why we've got all of this chaos happening in the world.
Well, and also, the whole notion of there are people that think stormtroopers are going to knock on your door, or, boots on the ground. They don't need to do that anymore, right? I mean, they can kill your credit card, make life so difficult. Matt was talking about this in his recent article. And everything is a process today. You go to fly, it's a process. You go to do anything, you can't call anybody. Most of these companies, it's all automated. So nothing is simple. Everything is aggravating. And I mean, maybe it's me. Maybe I'm just get cranky I'll be 47 at the end of the month. So maybe this is my older age coming out. But they're going to make that more difficult for people. And then, they'll single out certain individuals and make things even more uncomfortable for them. Oh, this might not work, or, can't order this, or what have you. I mean, that's all they need to do.
Yeah, it's easily done. It's easily done. Most of us, or most people, don't have any idea the threat that they face as an individual. I mean, if we're talking about a global hybrid war, you're in that war too, and you're actually considered an enemy combatant purely because you have the potential to disrupt it. The big powerful entities in this world, they never want people like us, the everyday people, the citizens, to have a say in it. They want us to be propagandized so we can be dragged along to their future. And that's precisely what's happening this time around. I mean, we know what the goal is. It's to have a full-blown technocracy where your entire life is digitized and you can be easily tracked and surveilled. And yeah, if you make any decisions that they don't like, they can just turn you off. I mean, this podcast, Mike, maybe in 5 years, this podcast would get you put on some list, and the next day you wouldn't be able to buy or sell. Your electric car wouldn't start. Your front door would remain locked. Who knows? It's all possible. And so I think that is where we're going. And I think we're already seeing strong pieces of evidence, and that's across the world. This is ubiquitous. It's not China trying to do this. They're doing this in the US. They're doing this in Canada. They're doing this across the world, and they're going to try and convince people to go along with certain parts of it. But my solution to that is to actually go back to becoming more self-reliant. I think the more self-reliant you are, the less easily swayed and manipulated you'll be in the future. So that's the best solution right now. But it does require, I'd say, a lot more people to get on board with it because ultimately, I think ultimately that if you've got 95% of the population stuck in dependency on in a digital system, the remaining 5% might be able to continue for some time. But yeah, it will be a difficult road ahead. You'll kind of be like, I don't know if you've read Brave New World. You'll be one of the savages on the outside, and I'm happy to be a savage, Mike. But I don't know about my wife and mother and parents-in-law and people like that. So yeah, I think now it's just a really good time for people to reflect on what real freedom actually is. What is true liberty? True liberty to me is independency. It's having the ability to do and think as I please within natural law. I mean, I'm not going to steal from somebody. I'm not going to, harm somebody else. But nobody should interfere in our lives either. We should have the freedom to live as we see fit. And I think the more you entwine yourself with the old system and the more dependent you are, which is kind of what the old system was built for, is to make you dependent. It was to make you have no skills, no ability to provide for yourself and your family. I mean, one thing that I said recently in a note on Substack was that most people today, if you turned out their power within 2 days, they would be absolutely screwed. Most people today would be absolutely screwed with a few days without power, a few days without food. Now, I don't know why any self-respecting kind of man or leader of a family, it could be a female, but anyone that's leading a family would have, let's say, a few $1 million in investments and not have the capacity to feed oneself or to heat your house without the electricity grid. That just seems crazy to me. Like I'm sure if we went back to our ancestors from the 1900s and told them that one day somebody would have all kinds of crazy fictional assets, digital assets, Bitcoin, equities, but they wouldn't be able to feed themselves or to provide energy and heat for themselves in a crisis. They wouldn't be able to light a fire, a stove at home. They wouldn't have the capacity to survive -20. They would think we was insane. They'd say, what kind of world have you create for yourselves? What kind of bind have you put yourself in? So I'm all about trying to just remind people of what's real, what's real, what's important. And I think, just a little bit of self-sufficiency will give us all a lot more collective say in how the future looks. More dependency gives us less collective say. And we're going to be, unfortunately, probably taken towards the West potential outcome, which is a full-blown technocracy.
Yeah, and I feel like the foundation is already there. And when I was talking to somebody and doing a little bit of just kind of doing some looking up on things on the internet, and I didn't realize that in America the first federal income tax was 1913, and ultimately here in the United States we are enslaved, and the federal income tax is was the start of it, because they've now made the tax system so confusing to where, even CPAs don't understand it. But yet, if they want to single you out, they can just go to the tax return and they'll find something, because it's so complex, nobody understands it. So now, and then what they do with that, so they have that in place, and then they've taught people over many years to what you said earlier with go to school, debt, credit cards are right on campus, handles things out to you. Student loans, the cost of college has gone up and up and up. Where I went to school is now $30,000 a year for a general degree in finance or marketing or sociology. So you're in the hole, depending on if you live on campus, how long you do that for, $100,000. You can never pay that back. You get a marketing degree, you're in the whole 100,000, then you have to go get a job that you don't want to do to pay that off. Then you continue to finance, you get a new car. Cars are what, 40,000, 50,000 now for a decent automobile?
Priced in gold, a college education has never been cheaper. Priced in gold, US properties have been declining since the year 2000. The barrel of oil has fallen from around 3.5 to 4 ounces of gold per barrel in the 1970s to about 1 ounce. Well, it's less than 1 ounce a barrel today. The price of electricity, it's never been cheaper. It's never been cheaper, Mike, when priced in gold, ounces. My point is, the problem we've got is that they have created this Ponzi scheme because we're not getting paid in gold ounces. Our labor has never, ever been more devalued than it currently is. And Matt did a great article on his Substack recently where he'd read that book about the construction, I think it was of the Panama Canal, and he was saying what people got paid as an engineer when priced in gold ounces back 100 years ago. And then he compared it to what an engineer gets paid today. And I've done this many times for all different asset classes, for all different types of role in society. And that's the problem. The problem is the system is an illusion that's based on debt and priced in gold. Everything's cheaper, but we ain't getting paid in gold, and most people aren't buying gold. So, and that's just self-protection. It's not going to fix the system. And so I don't see that improving, because we're now going into a major debt crisis globally. We've got the US, China, and Europe, the three largest economies in the world, that are literally now entering what Doug Casey calls the Great Depression. And I use that phrase too. It is the Great Depression. It's going to be far worse than the Great Depression. And these things can't be turned around in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. These things take a long time. Not many people know this, but back in the 1800s, do you know which country had the largest share of world trade manufacturing in the 1800s?
UK?
It was China. China had 33% of world trade in 1800, and it collapsed to about 2% within 50 years because of the Opium Wars and because of successive attacks through colonialism. Today, it's actually just about hit almost perfectly around 33%. It's almost exactly where it was 125 years ago. It took them, however, about 60, 70 years to get back to this point. The grinding higher and higher and higher. And it also took the Americans, the US being absolutely desperate to be able to find vessels for their ever-expanding debt pile that they were willing to transfer all of the manufacturing across. And the narrative now, of course, is that America is trying to unwind it and that America was taken advantage of. But, for the thinking out there, we know that's not true, that it was done intentionally. It was done out of desperation. So my point is, these things ain't going to be unwound quickly, and the debt will certainly not be, there'll be no debt jubilee. There will be a reckoning. And if you look back at when nations have amassed massive debt before, it's kind of like if we kind of zoom it into the individual level, like Mike, if you went out and got a load of debt and credit cards, or let's put it another way. Let's imagine you was married and you and your wife, you had a couple of cars, you had a house, you was going on 3 or 4 holidays a year. You was going out to nice restaurants. You had good clothes. And then your wife lost a job. Well, there's 2 things that you could do in that scenario. You could reduce your expenditure. So you could reduce the standards of living. You could go through a little bit of a hardship, make some sacrifices, and then try and come back around because your wife gets a new job. Or you could take out a credit card. You could take out a loan and continue to live at the same standard, the same level as you did before. But of course, now you're accruing a debt, and at some point that debt has to be paid. Now, maybe you get to the point where you're meant to pay the debt and you say, no, I'm going to take out more debt and I'm going to compound the debt. Well, that means that when you have that reckoning, it's not just going to be the kind of reckoning that you could have had to begin with when your wife first lost a job and you just had to tighten the belt and maybe cancel a few subscriptions. No, you're going to go through some major economic hardship now. And the longer that goes on for, the worse that economic hardship's going to get. And where we are now, we're talking about many Western economies that will look something like post-Soviet Russia, should I say, Russia after the collapse. And that's a more realistic outlook of the future. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be just the same. The world's very different. But my point is, that's more likely than this resurgence of the glory days and, when the US was a premier manufacturing unit, sadly. And even if it wanted to get back there, it would be, you need to have the come down after the drugs, Mike. You don't get all of the good stuff and then the bad stuff. And, I feel sorry for American citizens. They're in a hard spot, but it's the same across the West. I do think the world will be a little bit better in there's certain places in the world where I think people will have a fairer shake of the next decade or so. But I guess my point in saying all of that is it's time to just analyze the narratives we're being given and then think about the historical examples of what usually happens during this period, what usually happens when debt levels are this high and when nations are forced to kind of have a come to Jesus moment. And it's usually, major austerity, big job loss, and a period of real hardship. And I actually think that would serve the agendas right now because of, like we said, there's a lot of people out there who do want technocracy, who do want people to become less free. And I think if they see a clear path to that by having this kind of global depression, maybe that's the route they're going to go for. Maybe that's something that they would welcome.
Yeah, and this is where I mean, you understanding history. When you look back at certain periods of time, where we're at now because of technocracy and big tech and the instruments that they've built in order to keep it, to monitor all of us and tighten the noose. How does one even, you can't, to me, you can't stop this as they're implementing
No,
this new system. Not to interrupt you.
yeah, I think you just accept that there's only so much you can do as an individual, but I think that, like I said before, the more willing you are to take control, to become self-reliant and take responsibility for your immediate world, your small unit. If you see yourself as a small nation, what do you need to survive? You need some reserves. You need some money saved up in real money in gold. You need to have a view for the future. So you need to have a vision of where you want to go, what your plan is for you and your family. You need to have a community. So you want to be around people who have similar views. You want to, have some homogeneity there. You want to have the ability to feed yourself, to clothe yourself, to survive some hard times because nothing goes up in a straight line. And I think if you start from that premise, what do I need to do to take control of my situation and forget all the political stuff, forget the technocracy. It doesn't matter. Focus on your life, what you can do. And if some new obstacles come in the future that try to constrain you, well, you'll meet them as they come. You can prepare for certain parts of it now. You can think ahead. We've all got this beautiful ability that God gave us to think ahead, to, imagine different futures. So you can certainly prepare, but I don't think living in fear of those things is useful because ultimately my belief, having studied history, is that technocracy will collapse. My wife grew up in Soviet communism, and I can tell you it was the biggest black market in history. It was the most controlled system in history, and it was the biggest black market system in history. People were smuggling all kinds of goods. Everyone was a dissident, but everything goes underground in that world because nobody wants to stand out. So it looks on the outside like everyone's conforming, but all kinds of underground networks form. And, I've heard all the stories of people smuggling wedding rings across from Russia up their ass and all kinds of craziness was happening. My father-in-law, like he's about as straight as you're going to get. He's a guy who doesn't want to break any rules. He wants to follow all the rules. But when I hear what he was doing to survive during Soviet communism, like he was doing all kinds of stuff. He was smuggling, from country to country, risking getting put in jail, and that's because people were desperate. People, human beings have a affinity for liberty, and we go along with things so long as we feel it's in our interest, so long as we feel that at some point it's going to pay off. But once the velvet glove comes off and people say, "Oh, I see what this is about," then all of a sudden it starts to fall apart. And then it's just basically a waiting game. It's how long can they sustain it for? How long will it go on for before it collapses? So that's what I see the future as: a lot of disruption and ultimately a secondary collapse. Like we'll see the collapse of the old system, but the new system will then collapse in on itself again. And so for people like us, Mike, we're not that young, so we're going to probably live through a good portion of that. And I hope on the other side of it that the people who do take stock and the people who take action now, that they'll actually, survive quite handily and they'll be able to help build whatever system comes next. And like I said, I don't think it's the entire world that's going through this. It is really Western centric. They, in my opinion, would like to see the West collapse. I think there's an appetite for that because we are the freest people in the world still, and the US the freest of the free. So there's going to be a special focus on the US in getting people to give up their liberties, I think.
And I don't think the masses really still really understand where this whole thing is at because, I mean, I still will come across people that think that, Trump hasn't been in office that long. You're not giving him enough time. Maha's going to save us. Kash Patel's going to save us. Dan Bongino's, on and on and on and on and on. And, I wonder, when this happens, because you can only, hide it for so long. What will people do? How will they respond when they realize that, in my eyes, it's not salvageable any longer?
Well, if you look back at what happened in Soviet Russia when it collapsed and it went back to just being Russia, life expectancy of men went down to about 55. There was rank alcoholism, child prostitution, collapse of cities, infrastructure just failing. It was a mess. And whilst I don't think the US will look quite like that, I think if you look at how bad things have gotten already in inner cities. We spoke about this before the show, Mike. Just entire districts now filled with people strung out on drugs. We've got, in terms of migration in the West, in Europe, it's just a mess. We've got again cities that look like they're going to collapse, and so much antagonism in society. You've got all these different groups that are just waiting to kick off, like a Hunger Games. Like in the UK, I always joke we have border wars between India and Pakistan in London and Birmingham and all up and down the country. If something kicks off in any country in the world, you can guarantee there'll be embassies burning down in Great Britain because we've got so many people stuffed in there from all these different places. So that's going to be a mess. That's never worked in history. It's always led to, war, internal war. And again, it's not going to be the kind of stuff that we're used to in terms of the history books, like a full-blown civil war. It's going to be more chaotic. It's just going to be a dangerous time. It's not going to be nice if you're in those places. And I see videos coming out of the US of teenagers just ransacking malls, and you go to certain stores and everything's behind plastic. And whilst I don't know if that's all representative of what all of America is like, I'm sure it's not. I'm sure there's plenty of places that are fine, but when people lose their life savings, when their pensions, when they find out that those pensions, which are underfunded, are gone, or it buys them a few loaves of bread, like people did when the Soviet Union collapsed, like my parents-in-law found out once the currency collapsed in the 1990s, and everything they had in the bank literally got slashed down to about 15-20% of its worth. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of mad people. Even a good man could lose his mind in that situation, if they find out that they've lost a lot and that the future that they've got, that they thought they had, that they've been clinging on to. Because most people work their entire lives with this vision: I'm going to retire, I'm going to be happy, I did it all right. That goes back to what we said before. You think you're doing the right thing. You've got your 401k, it's invested in the Mag 7. You've got the Mag 7, three companies that are worth more than the entirety of the Chinese stock market. I mean, come on, Mike, it's an illusion. And unfunded liabilities, 140, 150 trillion now in the US. It's not going to get paid. So now's the time. Yeah, now's that time in history where you just have to take notice of these things, and nobody else is going to fix these things for us. So yeah, start taking action that's ultimately my core message. If you listen to my content, is I am a contrarian. I'll try and remove the propaganda from the narratives. Maybe I'm wrong, but at least I'll give you a fairer view than what you're going to get from most places, and then to take action on it. And there's plenty of things we can do. We spoke about our friend Matt Smith. He's down there in Uruguay for a reason. He's chosen to go down there for a reason. And I've got people that I work with. I consult with people all across the world who are looking to get themselves ready for harder times. And there is no right answer for everyone. We've all got different, we're all at different stages in our life. We've all got different obligations, different commitments that we might have to stick to. So whilst for somebody the best place might be Uruguay, it could be, Argentina for somebody else, it could be Hungary for somebody else, it could be Thailand. It really does depend on you. What is your financial capacity? What means do you have? What are you willing to live like? Not everyone wants to live on a farm. Some people want to live in a city. So I think there's plenty of opportunities for people to take action and to really thrive going into the harder times. And I do think it will be harder times. I'm kind of certain on that part. But there's plenty of opportunities to thrive and to go about your life. I mean, you had Luke Groman on recently, and he gave quite an optimistic at the end that, people just live through these times. You just get on with it. And I can say in my wife's country, that's precisely what happened. People just lived. They got on with it. Yes, there was deaths of despair. Yes, there was lots of people who turned to alcohol and drugs. That's going to happen. But in the more homogenous societies, I think you'll ride the harder times out. And also societies that have had a recent experience of hardship. So over here, everyone under 40 grew up under communism. Most families still have a farm in the family. Most people still have chickens. And, you go to a city here even, there's backyard chickens everywhere. There's polytunnels everywhere. There's people growing. So those places will be fine. But the places where they won't be fine will be the places where people are extremely dependent on the system, low culture, immorality is already rife, and yeah, lots of anger. And I think the West, that ticks all those boxes, sadly. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't places you could thrive in the West too. You know, if you get yourself out to a more rural location around people who are already taking care of their own needs, you'll be fine. But definitely want to be out the cities. Yeah, that's the one place you don't want to be, in my opinion.
Yeah, I like. It was ironic that Luke and I went to the same high school. You know, what a small world. And but one of the things he said that stuck out in my head, it was, you know, you adapted. Okay, so maybe you were able to buy 5 loaves of bread. Now you only buy 3, but that's what you do. You call an audible and you make adjustments accordingly, and that's how you get through this.
Yeah, I think some people will have the capacity to do that, but many people in the West won't because they've just not experienced anything like that. You know, it's going to be like a wrecking ball hitting their house. That's the big worry, is people that have, because really, in my opinion, what it's about, Mike, it's about the disparity from the old life to the new one. Like, how big is that gulf going to be? What kind of drop in standards of living is it going to be for people who are already living on a little homestead and a farm, and they don't need all the trappings of the modern world? Then there's not going to be much change for those people. There's going to be less money, which is what people complained about in the Great Depression. But the people who thrived in the Great Depression were the farmers, because they didn't need to trade their labor for the necessities of life. They traded their they traded their labor for the necessities of life, but it was direct in that they put their labor into their own land, and it was there for them. It's the people who traded their labor for currency to buy the necessities of life that were screwed. Because, like I said, since the year 1970, our labor has been cheapened progressively. That's not going to increase now. That's going to get worse. It's going to speed up. The goal is to devalue the dollar. They've actually even admitted that. And it's the same for all currencies. So it really is going to be UBI for the masses. It's going to be get them straight onto a UBI and give them, you know, some kind of rations. That's where it will end up. So you want to be in a place where the fall is not going to be so great, where people might have to tighten the belt a bit, but they're already living in a very self-reliant way. They're not expecting too much. In the West, our expectations are so high. The drop is going to be like jumping off the Grand Canyon. It's going to be massive, and I don't think people are ready for that. You know, I don't think people are ready for that, especially young people. You know, they're not going to be able to cope with that. So yeah, that's my advice to anyone listening, is just think about where the drop is going to be a little bit more shallow, because people can ride those things out. You can ride out hard times, but if the drop's too big, then it will crush people psychologically, and that's when people get angry, and you know, you get them all. I mean, the country that my wife's from, she in the 1990s, that was the most dangerous country in Europe. The murder rates in that country were the highest. Now it's the safest country in Europe. And it's had about 24 years consistent growth. It was one of the poorest countries in Europe. It's almost wealthier than the UK now. And by 2030, it will be. Standards of living are flying. Even during the Great Depression, it was the only country in the world that had no recession. It continued to grow throughout it. So the reason why I'm sharing that example is that country collapsed in 1990. Economic collapse, hyperinflation. And today, safest country in Europe, the best growth in Europe. It's got some of the highest standards of living per capita in the world, especially in Europe. So there's always another new dawn. You know, there's always going to be a better system. But there's that period. It's just that period, that 10, 15-year period where things get messy, and you have to be able to just ride that bit out. And you want to ride it out in style. You know, you want to be able to not have to worry, am I going to get fed tomorrow? Or do I have to go fight for a tin of beans at the supermarket? Or is my neighbor going to loot me and rob me? Those are the kind of things that you don't want to have to deal with. You know, you want to feel like you're safe, and you've got certainties and assurances that unfortunately the system can't provide for you anymore. So now you have to engineer those assurances for yourself. And that's kind of where I go with it.
You know, the other thing that's been occurring in the cities, I don't know if it's happening in the UK, but it's particularly in the Midwest, streetcar racing. These cars organize, and they go into these downtown areas like on a Friday or Saturday night and basically shut down parts of the city. with their street racing, or they block off exits to the interstate so you can't get on or off. It happened in Cleveland, where I'm from, last year. Terrified. People were terrified, calling in 911. It took the police, I want to say, 45 minutes to an hour, if not longer, to respond.
It reminds me of Grease, the movie Grease, Grease Lightning. I think it's probably a little bit more hostile than the movie Grease, right?
I was thinking the original Mad Max.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the things though. When you talk about these things, people like I often get a lot of pushback in my comment section on YouTube, not from my like kind of regular audience, but somebody. I mean, I'm sure listeners hearing me now, especially if they've got a much more rosy outlook of the future, are like this guy's out of his mind, and they say, this is not going to happen. Like the world can't collapse like that, and I'm like, you're already in the collapse. That's what you need to get your head around. You're already in the collapse. Just look at where we was in the 1970s when you had one man going out to work and he could survive and provide for an entire family. Today, you've got two people that can't afford to live. Just look at the chaos that we're seeing in our streets. Look at the levels of violence. All of it is symptomatic of collapse, and it's a long decline that we've been on. It's not something that's happened overnight. I often joke that when I was younger, I remember there was a video. Do you remember the pop artist Robbie Williams, who was in that band Take That?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. There was once he released a song and it was like him kind of dancing in his clothes, and then he started to strip off, and then by the end of it, he's just in his underwear, and then he starts to kind of rip off his skin, and it was really poor CGI at the time, and you can see all of his muscles and sinew, and it was so controversial. They banned it. They said you can't play this video until after 9 p.m. Now, that was in my lifetime. That was when I was I don't know, I was maybe a teenager, maybe a young teenager. That's what society was like back then. Now, look at where we are today, what you can show on TV. There's no watershed now. You've got kids walking around with phones with all kinds of craziness and violence and pornography. So that just shows you the cultural collapse that we've seen. That it used to be considered obscene for some crappy, tacky CGI to be shown. It was so offensive. Or even to show like a little bit of skin, on a pop video. And now it's like, pop video today is like close to hardcore pornography. It's crazy. The dancing, the talking about all kinds of things you wouldn't want your children listening to. So all of these things are just a sign. So when people, say, oh, it's you're fear mongering, you're a doomer. It's like, no, you need to zoom out a little bit. These things can't go on forever. And at some point, the piper has to be paid for things that we've done to our societies, and I think we're getting there. And I don't think it's going to be just you wake up one day and you go outside and it looks like Mad Max. I think it's going to be you go outside and you've just got drug addicts all over the city, and you've got all the stores closing down, and your kids don't want to go to school, and if they do, they come out a radical Marxist or with green hair and wanting to cut off their genitals. That's what a society in collapse looks like. Exactly what we've got. That's what it looks like. It doesn't look like we're fighting for water, but it could get there. It could get there if it gets really chaotic. And I think the certain places and certain times where it could get like that, and it could be intermittently like that. We could have power outages, for example, that lead to people not being able to get food. So again, yeah, you just have to have a broader view of what a collapse looks like. It's not necessarily going to be like a Hollywood movie, but there will be aspects of it that are really bad and dangerous, and you don't want to be there during those times. And you were speaking earlier, Mike, about Arizona and what it's like there. Like, what was it like when you was younger? Did you see stuff like that? Did it look like that?
No, I mean, I moved here, I was 28, it'll be 19 years in December. I don't ever remember, and even where I live now, I've been over 11 years in the same place, same neighborhood, and I just see more homeless. Like I live butt up against the desert. I go out and run, and this just happened to me a couple days ago, where I was in a section of the desert where guy rode his bike past me. I could tell he was a homeless, and I was turning around to head back home, and I had two options: either go right or go left on the trail. I'm like, all right, which way is this guy going? Because I want to try to guess the opposite. Well, I didn't, and I saw this guy walking his bicycle on a bike path with a lot of higher trees, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to run right by this guy. If something were to happen, I'm in a really bad spot here where this could be a problem. So I wasn't that far from the other going the other direction anyway. So I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to trust my instincts and turn around and just go the other way. And but I thought to myself, I'm like, this is not where I want to live. This is because you're dealing with a whole. You don't know what you're dealing with people like that. You have no idea what the mindset is, and they're everywhere around here, Mike. I mean, it's unbelievable. I walked out my door the one night. I'm on the second floor, and there was one underneath because there's a water spigot. They were filling up their water bottles and going back into the desert. I didn't see that 10 years ago.
Yeah, and I think as well, like, when we look at like the homeless and drug addicts, and clearly that's, it's a problem that's skyrocketing. But then there's a layer that we don't see. Like I'm talking about at the mean, just like with young people who have been brought up in this culture, and there's a lacking of empathy. There's almost like an enjoyment in violence and seeing other people suffer. You see these videos all the time of two kids at a school fighting. One of them clearly in a position of power over the other, so it's bullying. It's like, and everyone around is just watching and filming. And this isn't a one-off. This is happening across the West. You see somebody in the street, like a woman with a child being assaulted, and people just stand back and watch. This is the moral decay. This is the moral decay, and those things don't get fixed in 5 years. They don't get fixed in 10 years. You have to really rewrite society. So, and at the ground level, you have to get you have to dismantle the old system. You have to build a new structure. You need to build communities where you've got people who actually care about one another and have a common good and actually agree what are we trying to achieve here as a nation. What do we stand for now? And all of that's gone. Sad to say, all of that's gone. And so what you need is for people who do have empathy and who are decent people and do ascribe to what the founding fathers were trying to promote, which was, true liberty. And I would say a spiritual element too. Personally, I think that great societies always need to have shared beliefs, good beliefs, in something strong, like a creator that actually wants to endure us, empower us with self-sovereignty. I think all of those things matter, but those things take a long time to build. They're not something that we can just recreate overnight. We can build them in small spaces. You can turn your house into a place that fosters, free speech and critical dialogue and, cultured conversations. You can do that in your own space. You can make communities that have that kind of embedded into the fabric of the community. But as a society, it's not there. We're actually at the complete opposite end of that. And it'll probably get worse before it gets better. But on the other side of the hard times, you often find that people all of a sudden leap forward in terms of their ability to come together, because the hard times force people, you either sink or swim in the hard times. When you don't have all the safety nets anymore, it's a case of, the strongest survive, and out of the strongest, you get better people. I think that's probably what we're going to have to endure, because there's no way we're going to fix this in 5-10 years, Mike. You look at the education system, it needs completely dismantling. And then you need to bring those kids up, right? You need to bring them up over 20-30 years. Then they'll pass on those morals to the next generation. They'll build on it. And that's a long process. It's a long process.
What is your, as we've talked here for almost an hour, what's at the top of your mind in terms of what you're focusing on and what you're paying attention to?
In terms of what I'm focusing on right now, Mike, I would say for me, I generally try to focus on looking at history, drawing the historical parallels, and then trying to share them with people, because I think there's a lot to be mined there about coming through these times. There's a book called The Grapes of Wrath. There's many books that you can find on the Great Depression. There's lots of interviews, even on YouTube, of people who survived those times. So I'm trying to really collate that knowledge and to share it to a modern audience in a way that's appealing, because whilst some of it sounds a bit doom and gloom, I'm not going to lie, it is, because there's a realism to all of this. There is a truth that we have to accept. But on the other side of that, if you're willing to accept that things are going to get harder and, you don't want to bury your head in the sand, then there's a lot you can do. And I actually love living that way. I think it's really nice to go back to living simply, to not have a TV, to not need the modern conveniences, and to spend your evenings chatting, talking around a fire, singing a song, playing some get board games, whatever. Like, I think there's a lot to be said for going back to simplicity. So I'm trying to hopefully draw people's attention to that. And, you know, maybe it's not for everyone. Maybe the best thing for some people is to go retire in Mexico and, just live on the beach or something whilst all this unfolds and hope that it doesn't get to them. But yeah, that's kind of what I focus on. Community building as well is important to me, trying to, build a network of good people across the world. A lot of, we've got mutual friends, podcasters, people who are smart and that are sharing, wisdom with other people. I like to have those conversations, kind of like this one. And personally, yeah, I live a dual life. So I support people through my content. I've got a financial newsletter where I guide people how to protect and preserve wealth during these times and hopefully grow it, because there will be opportunities. There always is in crisis. And obviously community build through my Substack and my Patreon. And then also personally, I've got this other life. I am actually a farmer. So, I'm working the land. We've got food growing out back now, and yeah, I actually have my hands dirty most days as well in farming. So and that's a part of what I do as well. Is something where I have to, I've got to spend a lot of time doing that. So I do lead two lives, supporting people with the wealth, and then as soon as I've finished, I'm off back in the garden and working on my own land.
People are going to ask me. I mean, we've talked about Matt Smith. What other accounts, either on X, Substack, are you following for your information?
I'm going to embarrass myself a little bit here, Mike, and I don't follow a lot of people because a part of what I enjoy is not having too many opinions floating around in my mind, so I can try and analyze things from my perspective. I find if you have too many voices, you end up getting other ideas, and it can convolute that process of thinking through something critically. So I don't have a really long list. Doug Casey, for sure. I mean, Doug is like kind of a hidden mentor to a lot of people. He was one of the first people I started listening to a decade ago. And whilst I don't always have the same opinions of Doug, I just love the way Doug thinks. Doug, if you ask him a question, he's not like me who just starts rapid firing a load of words. He stops, he thinks. Sometimes you hear him thinking, he goes, huh. And then he'll, go into like, he'll have a think through before he answers. So I've always loved the way Doug Casey thinks, and I think he's kind of a really good role model for people in terms of managing harder times. Like, he's somebody who's very frank, and I love his honesty too. That's another thing about Doug, is his integrity, like his honesty. If you ask him about somebody, he'll tell you what he really thinks. He doesn't sugarcoat things, and yet he's got a lot of decorum. He's not somebody who's trying to flame other people, but he's an honest man. So Doug Casey for sure. Palisades Gold Radio, I listen to that. My friend Tom Bodrovics hosts it. He's a stand-up guy. He's actually just released his own podcast called the Competent Man Podcast. So maybe that's somebody that you would enjoy talking to, Mike. His new podcast is all about helping men to actually become more competent in real skills. And that's perfect for what we are heading into. I think skills are your biggest asset, what you can do. Upskilling yourself right now has zero downside and all benefits. Learning how to wire electrics, learning how to fix your own car, whatever it is. And Tom's a really good example of that. Like myself, he was an athlete for a lot of years. He still is actually competitive. And he's just somebody who loves to be independent. So he's another guy that I've got a lot of respect for. And those are probably my top three: Doug Casey and Matt Smith and Tom Bodrovics. Who else? Oh, listen, there's loads, Mike. I could go through a list of the cool people that I've met and whose work I respect, but I'll leave it with those three.
Yeah, I would add to. I know David Webb you've had on. I've had on before, and then Michael Yan and Matt Bracken are some of my. Jim Kunstler, if you're familiar with Jim Kunstler, and.
Yeah, David Rogers Webb, definitely. I'm a good friend of David's. I was out at his farm last year. I stayed with him for a little while, and we were in regular contact. Definitely huge respect for David Rogers Webb, one of the smartest guys that I've ever met. And, in Ireland, there's a guy called Rick Moon, who I've got a lot of respect for. Staying Free podcast I listen to quite regularly as well. Johnny Hoddle. Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot of great people that you meet through kind of what we do. I have my own show as well, so I get to speak to a lot of people. And I'm not somebody who kind of looks for big names like, oh, I want to get this guy on the show or that guy. I look for good people, like the people I want to speak to. If I don't enjoy the conversation, then I'll never, I wouldn't invite somebody on if I thought I wouldn't enjoy that person as a real human being outside of what they do. So I kind of, I've been blessed with a good audience of people and a good set of guests on my shows. And I mean, what number are you on to, Mike, in terms of your podcast?
This will be 1,134, I think.
Yeah, so that's quite the network that you've built of people, right?
Yeah, it's great. Life is not a straight line. This was never the intention when I started this almost 7 years ago. And even the conversations that I was having, I mean, this is not what I envisioned when I kicked off episode 1. So it's crazy, man, where life takes you. I mean, you look at yourself and you look at all the, your Substack, your show, personal life. I mean, do you ever take a step back and you're like, wow?
Yeah, it's strange how life twists and turns. I feel, I've had a very interesting life, and I'm blessed for that. And I like that my life was kind of top loaded with difficulties for the first, let's say, 25, 30 years, because it gave me a capacity to not feel stressed too much during these times. Like, I don't worry about the future per se. And I'm not somebody who is overly emotional in terms of excitement. Like, I don't get too excited about things. But I have to say, like, it's been a real trip just to meet some of these people that I used to admire and look up to. I used to listen to Doug Casey. I mean, this was before Matt was on the show. And he was doing Doug Casey's take. But, to chat with Matt and to, Tom Bodrovic's, like, Palisades Gold Radio, it was one of my favorite shows, and then I've been on that show 3 or 4 times now. So it's always awesome, to network. And I think like attracts like. If you're a good human being, you will meet the other people. And that's one of the things I would say to listeners too, is once you start taking action and you create a path for yourself and kind of a vision of where you want to go and what you want to do, you will be amazed at how many people just appear that are the right people to help you move further along in that journey. I'm sure you've experienced this too, Mike, doing what you do. You started this podcast. On day 1, you probably thought, is anyone ever going to listen to this? Is anyone going to want to come speak to me? And now here you are at 1,000 episodes. And that's how life works. It unfolds without you being able to always see it. But so long as you in your mind can have a vision for yourself, you'll find that, wow, it really does start to play out well for me. And yeah, that's the hope as well. Like, so long as you are able to envision a future that's positive, I think you'll be amazed that the universe wants to help you in a sense. I think it's strange how it works.
Well, and I also think too is, going back to, I know we're wrapping up here, but going back to, your upbringing, and mine was a little bit different, but, I came from, my father was a gambler. We ended up losing everything. Our house got foreclosed on, nice house, nice cars. When I was a kid, I got everything I wanted. I mean, the one year for Christmas, I got a Nintendo, a scooter, and a color television. Shows you my age. It was a great Christmas. And to where the house that we were in, we lost it. I ended up in an apartment with my mother in a 2-bedroom. And, but it made you realize at a young age when you're going through this, you're like, man, am I ever going to get to the other side of this? But not only is it hard on you, you realize you don't need much to survive. And you learn to not be so attached to those material things. And I wonder if that's the same for you.
Yeah, definitely. I purposely practice simplicity, so voluntary simplicity. That I get cold showers every day. We don't have hot water unless we put a fire on. In summer, I get showered in the garden. It's just with a can of a rainwater can. So yeah, I keep things really simple on purpose, because at the end of the day, luxuries are just that. The luxuries, they're not necessary, and they don't actually add much to your life. And I like to keep myself sharp in a sense, so by having volunteer, I mean, you said that you go for runs. I was an ultra runner for a lot of years, so I embraced the hardship of running. I used to run, 100-kilometer races, in the mountains. I still run regularly. And I love to push myself in physical exercise, hill sprints, anything. Like I just love that feeling of pressure and having to force myself through something that's difficult. So I embrace all of that and I guess it makes life easier because most of the time life doesn't feel like that. So if you're used to that and you bring it into your life voluntarily, you'll find that you'll ride out the slings and arrows of your day-to-day life much easier. And it's kind of like people say, oh, why would you want to do a lot of exercise? And it's like, well, when you're old and you're unhealthy and you're out of shape and you've got heart problems and all those things, and I'm not saying exercise is going to cure everything, but that's way more difficult than it would have been just doing 20, 15 minutes of intense exercise a day or a few runs. So I purposely bring voluntary hardship into my life. I embrace it. I enjoy it. And yeah, it's for me, life's always good. I think there's always a way through a situation. And I guess that's a good philosophy to live by. It's that stoicism.
I have a huge appreciation for ultra running. I used to MC a company out here in Phoenix announcing ultra marathons in my previous life. So I was actually just following the Cocodona 250 mile that is wrapping up. Cam Haines finished it. Courtney DeWalter was in it. She dropped it 100 mile 108. I don't know if you know any of these people, but
I do.
Yeah. My friend is one of the co-owners of Air Viper Running, who I've had on here a bunch. He lives in Phoenix. His name is Nick Curry, and his brother Jamil is like the face of it.
I know. Yeah, I know these names, all of them. I never knew that. What? See, there you go. There's another interesting synchronicity.
Yeah, Nick was the fourth episode I ever did, fourth or fifth episode. However many years ago.
Have you run an ultra, Mike? I feel like we're having like one of those conversations that the listeners are like, this one should have ended, but have you ever run an ultra?
So it's funny you asked that because I had never even knew what an ultra was until I got introduced to that world when the movie Unbreakable came out back in 2011, November of 2000.
That was the film that got me into ultra running.
Phenomenal movie. I ran. Hal Kerner was
one of the listeners is one of the best sports movies in history. Just don't read anything about it. Just get the film Unbreakable. You can find it on YouTube if you've never seen it and you like sports. Literally one of the best sports films, documentaries that's ever been created.
And when you watch it, you just want to go run. And like so back when that movie came out, the soundtrack for it, I couldn't find it. So I was going through and Shazamming every song that was featured in that movie because I wanted to put it into my playlist so that I could run with it. But that's when I was introduced to it because I had no idea that people did those things. So to answer your question, the most I ever did was 50 Ks, but it was like training runs, like building. But like my body hurt so bad after for 2 days after. I thought in my mind I was going to run 50 miles at some point, but I got 32 miles in a run. It's like, it's not like I can swap out my legs and get a fresh pair. And it was getting hot here in Phoenix. Like when I did it, it was like this time of year, beginning of May. So it just gets hotter and hotter and hotter. And I never went back to it after that. I did a 6-hour 5K loop. I did like 28 miles. But
wow.
that was it.
That's mentally tough. But a race just never feels like the training runs. The training runs are always tough, but what you find is in a race you get like you've got a 50-mile race and you get to 25 miles and it's just passed like that in the blink of an eye, and it doesn't feel I feel like I'm just getting started. Now definitely gets tougher. The third quarter of a race, the fourth quarter definitely gets really tough, but it's amazing how different the training runs feel, how much tougher they feel compared to the first part of a race. But yeah, those are good experiences, whatever it is for you that makes you feel a little bit of suffering and where you've got to overcome psychologically, really healthy experiences to have, I think. And if you find something that you can do it and enjoy, like ultra running, I love the community of ultra running. And I think you've met a few people that are in that community, so you'll know what I mean. It's a really cool community to be a part of. And yeah, I actually, that's what I was pursuing. I was going to be a professional ultra runner. I gave up my career and everything to kind of do that. And if it weren't not for injury, that's what I'd be doing today, I think, still. So that's another example of how life just twists and turns, because I wouldn't be here talking to you now about what we just spoke about had I not lost my running career and then had to reinvent myself and find something else to. All those hours, Mike, I spent training. It was like 40, 50 hours a week, 100 miles, 120 miles every week running. On top of that, all the therapy and yoga and all the other stuff you have to do. Once that was gone, I had this whole gaping chasm in my week. I was like, what am I going to do with myself? And that was about the time I met my wife, and I was like, right, well, I'm going to learn finance, and that's why I ended up where I was. So it's funny that we kind of ended on that little bit about ultra running because that was a key part of my journey too.
And now, how many miles a week do you put in?
I like to get out there. I don't really count the miles because I run a lot of trail or mountain trail, but probably about 5 hours a week is good for me right now. Yeah, that's a nice sweet spot. It gives me a lot of time out there. If I go too far beyond that, then I have to be careful because my injury that kind of ended my running career, it's kind of a lifelong thing that I have to manage. I just have to be careful with it, not push it too far. Otherwise, it can flare up, and when it flares up, it's a real pain in the ass because then it could be like 5, 6 months where it's constantly flaring up on runs, and then I've got to walk back after. You get 3 miles into a run, and then it's like, oh shit, I can't run anymore. Now I'm gonna have to walk back. So I've learned to really just be gentle on my body, and I think that's a part of aging. Is I've been an athlete for 25 years because I was a during high school. During my late teens, I was a boxer, competitive boxer for a lot of years. So really, I never gave up just training hard. So 25 years is a lot to put on your body. And, I've got a lot of things that I carried from boxing, like shoulder, rotator cuff, things like that. So I just learned as I got older to be a little bit more holistic in how I do things. Not, when you're an athlete, it's all about going all out, balls to the wall. You want to compete, you want to be the best. But these days, I'm just happy to get out there in nature, have an hour-long run, nice, easy pace, listen to the birds, maybe take a podcast with me, and just enjoy nature and get some space.
Well, you see Cameron Haynes, who just finished the Cocodona with a broken foot. His foot was broken, I guess, the whole race.
Wow, I never knew that. That's crazy.
I'm with you in that category. And last thing, I could talk to you for hours, Mike. I mean, I love boxing. I never fought, but I've been following boxing since I was a little kid. So.
Oh, well, Mike, we can have a conversation off air all about boxing anytime. I'll sit and talk to you about boxing for hours because I still follow it too.
That's funny. I had Fred. You know who Freddie Roach is?
Of course.
Yeah, he was the first podcast he ever did with me. It was episode 6 or 7.
Oh, wow. I'm going to go check that out. That's awesome.
Yeah. I was so nervous throughout that, and he called Mickey Rourke a pussy on our conversation from 7 years ago. True story. So.
That's crazy. Yeah, Freddie Roach. That's quite a name to have on a podcast. I don't know if I have had many boxing coaches on podcasts. I think it's probably more normal now, but back then it was quite rare, I think.
Yeah, and it was an arrangement that he worked for my uncle in Las Vegas in the 80s and the 90s. And my uncle had moved to Vegas, long story short, and connected with him and his brothers who were fighting out there. And when they were done, Freddie needed a job, and then he eventually became an assistant trainer for Eddie Futch, that was his trainer. Eddie Futch trained Joe Frazier in the Thrill of Manila. And then Freddie's career just kind of took off. Virgil Hill, Mickey Rourke, and then Manny Pacquiao, and a couple in between, and then the rest was history. So I just saw Manny Pacquiao's fighting in July.
Yeah, that's crazy. I was a huge fan of Pacquiao. He was one of my favorite boxers. I followed his career from really early on before he kind of hit. Well, he was winning world titles all throughout his career, but he was in the lowest weight classes before he really got to international fame. And what an exciting fighter he was, the way, the angles that he used to give and the speed. And it was just insane when he got up to welterweight. It was like, this guy, he should be at flyweight and he's at welterweight. So, yeah, what an amazing career. But to be fighting now, I mean, how old is he? He's in his 50s, I think.
No, he's 46. He's a few months younger than me, so he'll be 47 in December. I'll be 47 at the end of the month, and he'll be 47 in December.
Hey, so. Bernard Hopkins did it, so could happen.
I hate to see it. Mike, where can people find you?
You can find me on Substack. That's the best place. So Substack, it's just basically Parallel Systems. You'll find my financial newsletter and all of my financial articles. You can also find my channel on YouTube, which is again Parallel Systems.
Twitter. Patreon?
My Twitter is parallel_Mike and patreon.com parallel systems. And yeah, that's basically the same as my Substack. So whichever platform somebody prefers. I prefer Substack because I can upload my videos to there. So all of my, free content that I upload to YouTube, you can find it all on there as well as my notes. And if you enjoy kind of people who take a little bit more of a historical take on things, then you'll probably enjoy the show.
Well, and I just want to say this. I mean, for people that are going to listen to our conversation, I think there's good reason to follow Mike and support what he's doing, both from a financial preparation standpoint and ultra running and boxing. So, I mean, I think there's a very well-versed, array of topics that give people a reason to support you. So I thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thank you too, Mike. It was a pleasure speaking with you. And, I think if you'll join me on, I do have a podcast too, a long form podcast, which is not about finance. It's like kind of for all my other separate topics that I like to discuss because like there's a lot of things I'm interested in outside of what we just discussed. So if you'll join me on that show, I'll put you on the spot on air. Then I'd love to have you on as a guest on my show too.
Love to. Let me know anytime.
Cool. I'll send you an email about that, Mike.
Look forward to our next conversation. Mic drop.